You're useless, Emma. Too naive and sweet to be of any real value. Honestly, I've had enough. The words hit harder than any slap could. Emma stared at Nathan, her husband of 7 years, trying to process the cold detachment in his tone. They sat in a high-end restaurant in Manhattan, the dim lighting and elegant ambience doing little to soften the sharp sting of his cruelty. The clinking of crystal glasses and murmurs of nearby diners faded into background noise, leaving only the echo of his voice in her mind. She tightened her grip on the cloth napkin in her lap, her knuckles white. "You want a divorce?" The words escaped her lips in a shaky whisper, disbelief woven into every syllable. Nathan didn't even flinch. "I deserve someone who challenges me, Emma. Someone who isn't just there. You're too simple, too eager to please. It's exhausting." Her heart raced, not from heartbreak, but from the realization that she had been invisible to him all along. The man she'd supported, the life she'd built around him, it all crumbled with the casual flick of his words. She fought the lump rising in her throat, refusing to let tears fall in front of him. Without another glance, Nathan stood up, adjusted his designer suit, and left her sitting alone. The click of his polished shoes against the marble floor was the final punctuation to his dismissal. Hours later, Emma found herself on the cold hardwood floor of their luxury penthouse, the city lights casting fractured shadows through the expansive windows. She hugged her knees, silent tears tracing down her cheeks. The apartment, once a symbol of success and security, felt sterile and hollow, much like her marriage had been. In a desperate attempt to find something grounding, she stumbled upon an old sketchbook buried in the back of a dusty drawer. Inside were pages filled with designs, home layouts, fashion sketches, ideas she had once nurtured before Nathan convinced her they were foolish distractions. Her fingers traced the lines she had drawn years ago, each stroke reigniting a spark she thought had died. The pain didn't fade, but beneath it, something fierce began to flicker. "I'm not useless," she whispered to herself, the words shaky but defiant. "I was just trapped." And maybe it was time to set herself free. The morning light seeped through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Emma's penthouse, casting long, pale streaks across the cold, polished floors. She sat at the edge of the sleek, overpriced leather couch, staring blankly at nothing. The echoes of Nathan's words still rattled in her mind, each syllable lingering like an old wound that refused to heal. She reached for the coffee she'd made out of habit, the bitter taste hitting her tongue, sharp and unwelcome. Just like him. The penthouse, filled with designer furniture and art pieces Nathan had picked, felt like a museum, sterile, distant, and completely devoid of warmth. But it was the silence that screamed the loudest. Emma's eyes drifted to the sketchbook she had found the night before. It sat there quietly defiant, its pages filled with forgotten dreams and pieces of a woman she'd left behind. She opened it again, running her fingers over the rough sketches, designs for interior spaces, clothing concepts, color palettes. Ideas she'd poured her heart into before Nathan convinced her they were childish, unimportant. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. A message from Nathan flashed on the screen. "The lawyer will contact you soon. Let's keep this quick and clean." No apology, no remorse, just business like she'd been nothing more than an accessory in his curated life. Something inside her snapped. Emma stood up, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She wasn't going to let him define her anymore. She wasn't the fragile woman he thought he'd broken. She opened her laptop and started searching for job opportunities, anything that would pull her out of the suffocating shadow Nathan had cast over her life. Her eyes landed on a posting for an interior design assistant in Austin, Texas. It was bold. It was far, and it was exactly what she needed. But the job required a portfolio. She glanced at her sketchbook, then back at the screen. "I already have one," she whispered, determination growing in her chest. She spent hours scanning her drawings, adding notes and organizing them into a presentable format. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. Every page was a testament to the parts of herself she was ready to reclaim. When she hit send on the application, a wave of fear washed over her, followed closely by something she hadn't felt in years. Hope? She closed the laptop, her fingers lingering on the cover. For the first time in a long while, Emma realized she wasn't waiting for someone to save her. She was saving herself. The Texas heat wrapped around Emma the moment she stepped out of the airport, a sharp contrast to the cold detachment she'd left behind in New York. The warm breeze carried with it a promise, one she wasn't sure she fully believed yet, but enough to keep her moving forward. Austin was nothing like Manhattan. The skyline wasn't a wall of steel and glass. It was open, expansive, with hints of green peeking through modern architecture. The air smelled different too, fresher, with a hint of something wild and untamed, just like how she wanted to feel. Dragging her suitcase behind her, Emma checked into a small rental apartment. The space was modest, far from the luxury she was used to, but for the first time it felt like hers. No designer furniture Nathan had chosen. No cold, empty rooms filled with things that never felt like home. Just 4 plain walls and the beginning of something new. Her interview at Stone Plus Mason Design Cuppers was scheduled for the next day. She spent the evening rehearsing answers, flipping through her portfolio, second-guessing every sketch. Was it good enough? Was she good enough? The echoes of Nathan's dismissive voice tried to creep in, but she silenced them with sheer determination. The next morning, she stood in front of the sleek, modern office building, her heart pounding like a war drum. Taking a deep breath, she pushed through the glass doors. The receptionist greeted her warmly, guiding her to a waiting area flooded with natural light. Emma tried to steady her breath, fingers fidgeting with the edge of her portfolio. She glanced at the minimalistic decor, clean lines, bold accents. She could already feel ideas sparking, which was both terrifying and exhilarating. Then he walked in. Liam Mason, tall, effortlessly confident, with sharp green eyes that seemed to notice everything. His presence filled the room the moment he entered. Dressed casually in a crisp white shirt with rolled-up sleeves and tailored grey slacks, there was an edge to him. Not arrogance, but something raw, like he didn't waste time pretending to be someone he wasn't. "Emma Clark?" His voice was smooth, rich with a faint southern drawl. She stood, offering a handshake. The moment their hands touched, a jolt, not just nerves, shot through her. His grip was firm, warm, steady, everything she wasn't feeling at that moment. "Nice to meet you," she managed, her voice surprisingly strong. They sat across from each other in a sleek, glass-walled office. Liam flipped through her portfolio, his expression unreadable. Emma fought the urge to fill the silence with nervous chatter. Finally, he looked up, one brow slightly raised. "You've got an interesting eye for detail. Where'd you study?" She hesitated for just a beat. "Tell the truth, I didn't," she admitted. "I learned on my own. It's always been a passion, but life got in the way." Liam leaned back, studying her. Then slowly he nodded. "Passion's harder to teach than technique." His words settled over her like a balm. She felt herself breathe, really breathe, for the first time in days. As the interview wrapped up, he closed the portfolio, his eyes meeting hers again. There was something there. Not flirtation exactly, but an intensity that made the air between them feel charged. "Welcome to Stone Plus Mason, Emma." The words hit her like a rush of adrenaline. She'd done it, on her own. No Nathan, no crutches. As she stepped out of the office into the warm Austin sunlight, she realized something profound. This wasn't just a new job. It was the first step toward rediscovering who she really was. The days that followed felt like a whirlwind. Emma quickly adapted to the fast pace of Stone Plus Mason Design Co., immersing herself in projects that reignited a spark she thought had been lost. But no matter how busy she was, there was one constant distraction. Liam Mason. He was everywhere. In the office, his presence was impossible to ignore. He moved with effortless confidence, commanding attention without even trying. His sharp green eyes had a way of locking onto hers during meetings, making her pulse quicken in ways she wasn't ready to admit. One afternoon, Emma was called into a project meeting for the firm's latest endeavor, a luxury boutique hotel renovation downtown. She wasn't expecting to see Liam already there, leaning casually against the conference table, sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms dusted with faint scars that only added to his rugged appeal. His focus shifted from the design plans to her the moment she walked in. "Emma," he greeted, his voice low, a slight curve to his lips that wasn't quite a smile but enough to stir something deep in her chest. She nodded, forcing herself to look composed, though her heart betrayed her with its quick, uneven rhythm. As they discussed ideas, Emma found herself challenging him on design choices. He welcomed it, his eyes lighting up with interest, not just professionally but something else simmering beneath the surface. Their exchanges grew more intense, words laced with double meanings that neither of them dared to address out loud. Atiwa. One point. Liam leaned over her shoulder to examine a sketch she'd drawn. His breath was warm against her skin, sending a shiver down her spine. She could smell his cologne, subtle, woodsy, mixed with something uniquely him. The heat radiating from his body made her hyper-aware of every nerve ending. "You've got..." "An eye for flow," he murmured, his voice softer, almost like a secret meant only for her. Emma swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the pencil she held. "It's all about balance," she replied, keeping her tone steady, though inside she was anything but. Their gazes met, lingering for a second too long. It was just a look, but it felt like the beginning of something neither of them could control. Later, that evening after everyone had left, Emma stayed behind to finalize some drawings. She thought she was alone until she heard footsteps. Turning, she found Liam standing by the door, hands in his pockets, that same unreadable expression on his face. "You've got potential, Clark," he said quietly, the dim light casting shadows across his sharp features. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Her breath caught in her throat, not because of the words, but because of the way he said them, like he knew exactly what she'd been through without needing the details. After he left, the silence felt heavier, charged with something she couldn't name, but she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just professional admiration, it was a game of glances, lingering stares, and unspoken tension, and they were both already playing. The invitation came casually, almost like an afterthought. "We're hosting a networking event at the Driftwood Hotel this weekend. It'd be good for you to meet some of our clients," Liam mentioned as they wrapped up a meeting. His tone was professional, but the slight arch of his brow suggested there was more behind the offer. Emma hesitated. Crowded events weren't her thing, especially not with Liam Mason looming like an unsolvable equation in her mind. But saying no felt like surrendering to the tension building between them, and she wasn't ready to back down. The night of the event arrived faster than she expected. Emma stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the silky black dress that hugged her curves, fair in all the right places. It was simple but elegant, a far cry from the conservative outfits she used to wear when Nathan dictated her style. Tonight, she dressed for herself. The Driftwood Hotel was stunning. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Austin skyline, warm lights casting a golden glow over the sleek decor. The crowd buzzed with conversation and clinking glasses. But the moment Emma stepped into the room, her eyes instinctively searched for him, and there he was. Liam stood near the bar, dressed in a tailored navy suit, no tie, his shirt casually unbuttoned at the collar. His posture relaxed, a glass of whiskey dangling from his fingers, but his eyes, those piercing green eyes, found her within seconds. A subtle smirk curved his lips, sending a spark straight to her chest. She mingled, talked to clients, laughed, curt polite jokes, but every time she glanced across the room, Liam's gaze was there, unapologetically fixed on her. The tension stretched between them like an invisible thread, taut and unbreakable. Eventually, as if pulled by some magnetic force, they ended up standing side by side on the hotel's balcony, the city lights flickering below. "Didn't expect you to come," he said, his voice low, mixing with the soft hum of music from inside. Emma sipped her wine, feeling bold. "Didn't expect you to care," Liam chuckled, turning to face her fully. The dim light softened the sharp lines of his jaw, but his eyes remained intense, locked on hers. "I shouldn't," he admitted quietly, his fingers brushing the rim of his glass. "But I do." The confession hung between them, heavy and electrifying. Before she could overthink it, Emma replied, her voice just above a whisper. "That makes two of us." The space between them disappeared in an instant. Liam stepped closer, his hand lightly grazing her waist as if asking for permission. She didn't pull away. His touch was warm through the thin fabric of her dress, sending a rush of heat to places she hadn't felt alive in years. They stood there, suspended in the moment, hearts racing, breaths mingling, until a colleague's voice calling Liam's name snapped the tension. He stepped back, his hand lingering for just a second longer before falling away. "Another time," he murmured, his voice rough with restraint. Emma nodded, her heart pounding like a drum. She wasn't sure what just happened, but she knew it wasn't over, not even close. The days after the event at the Driftwood Hotel were a blur of stolen glances and simmering tension. Emma tried to focus on work, burying herself in design drafts and project deadlines, but every interaction with Liam was like walking a tightrope, balanced between professionalism and something far more dangerous. The inevitable breaking point came late one evening. The office was nearly empty, the hum of distant traffic the only sound beyond the quiet click of Emma's keyboard. She was finalizing a proposal for the boutique hotel project when Liam appeared in the doorway, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. Around his neck, his eyes met hers, a flicker of something dark and unresolved passing between them. Still here, his voice was casual, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. Emma forced a tight smile. "Deadlines don't care about business hours." Liam stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. The soft click echoed in the quiet space, sending a ripple of anticipation down her spine. He leaned over the edge of her desk, glancing at the sketches. His proximity was intoxicating, close enough for her to catch the faint scent of cedar and something distinctly him. His fingers brushed against the corner of the paper, then drifted closer until they accidentally grazed hers. The contact was electric. "Your designs," he murmured, his gaze lifting to meet hers. "They're bold, like you." Emma's breath hitched. She could feel the heat rising beneath her skin, her heart pounding in her chest. The tension that had been simmering for weeks now boiled over. Without thinking, without planning, she stood up. Their faces were inches apart. Neither spoke. Then, it happened. Liam cupped the side of her face with a firm, deliberate touch, his thumb grazing her cheekbone. His lips crashed against hers with an urgency that stole her breath. The kiss was intense, raw, filled with weeks of unspoken words and restrained emotions. Emma's hands found his shoulders, gripping tightly as if grounding herself. His body pressed against hers, pinning her gently against the desk. The taste of whiskey lingered on his lips, mixed with the faint bitterness of coffee, and it was intoxicating. She melted into him, her body responding to every touch, every breath. His hands slid down her sides, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless, their foreheads resting together, hearts racing in sync. "This is a mistake," Emma whispered, though her body betrayed her words, leaning into his warmth. Liam's lips curled into a half smile, his thumb tracing her jawline. "Then why does it feel so right?" She didn't have an answer, because it wasn't supposed to happen, but it did, and there was no going back. Emma had barely slept since that night. The memory of Liam's kiss haunted her like a song stuck on repeat. His hands on her waist, the taste of whiskey on his lips, the way his breath felt hot against her skin. She tried to convince herself it was a mistake, that crossing that line blurred everything she'd been trying to rebuild. But the problem was, she didn't regret it. Not for a second. Days passed with tense, stolen glances at the office, each interaction laced with unspoken words. The tension grew unbearable, suffocating her in moments that should have felt ordinary. One evening, as she sat in her small apartment, staring at her laptop, pretending to work, her phone lit up. "Liam, we need to talk. I'll be outside in 10. Her heart raced. Without thinking, she grabbed her keys and slipped into a light sweater, barely registering what she was doing until she was outside. The Austin night was warm, the sky painted with faint streaks of orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. Liam's car was parked at the curb. He leaned against it, his hands in his pockets, eyes dark and unreadable under the dim streetlights. Without a word, Emma walked toward him, The distance between them felt charged, magnetic. The moment she reached him, he didn't give her time to think. Liam cupped her face, his lips crashing against hers with the same urgency as before. But this time there was no hesitation. She responded instinctively, her fingers gripping the collar of his shirt, pulling him closer. Their bodies collided with a hunger that had been simmering for weeks. His hands slid down her back, anchoring her to him as if letting go wasn't an option. They stumbled into her apartment, kissing like they'd been starved for this. The door slammed shut behind them, unnoticed. Clothes fell away piece by piece, scattered like breadcrumbs across the floor. The feel of his skin against hers was overwhelming, hot, firm, real. Liam lifted her effortlessly, carrying her to the bedroom, his mouth never leaving hers for more than a breath. When he laid her down, it wasn't rushed. His hands explored every inch of her as if memorizing her curves, his lips trailing from her neck to her collarbone, leaving a path of fire in their wake. The room was filled with the sound of quickened breaths, the faint rustle of sheets, the soft creak of the mattress as they moved in perfect sync. Every touch, every kiss was a silent confession. When it was over, they lay tangled in the sheets, their bodies slick with sweat, hearts pounding like drums in the silence. Liam brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingertips lingering on her cheek. "This isn't just a mistake," he whispered, his voice low and rough. "It's more than that." Emma stared at the ceiling, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. She didn't reply. Because deep down, she knew he was right, and that terrified her more than anything. The morning after felt different. The sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting faint lines across the tangled sheets. Emma stirred, her body still humming from the night before. Her skin warm where Liam's hands had mapped her like a familiar landscape. She turned her head to find him watching her, his green eyes soft, but shadowed with something unspoken. She didn't know what to say. Instead, she slipped out of bed quietly, pulling on a t-shirt, trying to regain some semblance of normalcy. But normal had left the room the moment Liam's lips met hers. While she made coffee, her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it absently until the name on the screen froze her in place. Nathan. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't spoken to him since the divorce papers were finalized. The timing felt like a punch to the gut. Without thinking, she answered, "Emma." His voice was as cold as she remembered, smooth and sharp like glass. "I hear you've been busy." Her chest tightened. "How does he know? What do you want, Nathan?" she snapped, trying to keep her voice steady. "I just thought you should know you're making a mistake. Men like him don't stick around. But you know that, don't you? You've always needed someone to keep you grounded." Emma's grip tightened around the phone. She swallowed the lump in her throat, her heart racing, not from fear but from anger. "I don't need you to tell me anything about my life," she shot back, her voice steady now. "I'm not that woman anymore." Nathan laughed, low and bitter. "We'll see." She hung up before he could say more, her hand trembling slightly. The past had a way of creeping back in when you least expected it. When she turned, Liam was standing in the doorway, shirtless, his expression unreadable. He must have heard enough. "You okay?" His voice was softer than usual, his concern cutting through her like a blade. She forced a smile. "Yeah, just old ghosts." But Liam wasn't buying it. He crossed the room in 2 steps, his hand brushing her arm gently. "What did he say?" Emma hesitated. Part of her wanted to downplay it, to keep Nathan's poison out of this new part of her life. But she realized something. She didn't have to carry it alone anymore. "He knows about us," she admitted quietly. "And he's trying to get in my head." Liam's jaw tightened, a flicker of anger flashing in his eyes. "Let him try. He doesn't get to have that power over you anymore." His words settled over her like armor, strong and reassuring. But it wasn't just his words, it was the way he looked at her, like she was more than just the sum of her past mistakes. Later that day, Liam confronted Nathan outside the office building. The tension between them was palpable. Nathan wore his arrogance like a suit, smug and condescending, but Liam didn't flinch. He got in Nathan's face, his voice low and lethal. "Whatever hold you think you have on her, it's gone. You're nothing but a bad memory, she's finally learning to forget. Nathan smirked, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Fear. Not of Liam, but of losing control. Emma watched from a distance, her heart pounding. Not because she needed Liam to fight her battles, but because she realized something powerful. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not of Nathan, not of her past, and definitely not of the future. The confrontation between Liam and Nathan had left a ripple in Emma's life, one she felt even when pretending everything was normal. But it wasn't. Not anymore. Nathan didn't just vanish after Liam's warning. His shadow lingered, showing up in subtle ways. An unexpected email from a potential client backing out without reason. Awkward glances from co-workers who suddenly seemed to know too much. Nathan was playing a game, the kind where he didn't need to be physically present to cause damage. Emma sat in the office conference room late one evening, the city lights flickering against the windows like distant embers. She was going over project notes, trying to drown out her anxiety, when Liam walked in. His presence filled the space instantly, not just because of his height or confident stride, but because of the way her pulse reacted, as if her body recognized him before her mind did. He closed the door behind him, his jaw tight. I found out Nathan's been talking to some of our clients, Liam said, skipping any pretense of small talk. His eyes darkened with frustration. Trying to sabotage our contracts. Emma's stomach twisted, a mix of rage and dread swirling together. Of course he is. He can't stand the idea of not having control. Liam stepped closer, his expression softening slightly. We're not going to let him win. But Emma could feel it, the slow creep of fear. She thought she'd left behind, not because Nathan had power over her anymore, but because she hated the idea of him having power over her new life. Over Liam. I don't want you to get dragged into this, she whispered, her voice softer now. Liam's jaw clenched again, but this time with something different, something protective. Too late for that. Without warning, the tension snapped. Liam crossed the room in 2 strides, pulling her into his arms, his lips crashing against hers. The kiss was fierce, filled with frustration and something more, something desperate. Emma responded with equal intensity, her fingers tangling in his shirt, pulling him closer as if the space between them was unbearable. They stumbled back against the table, papers scattering to the floor unnoticed. His hands gripped her hips, lifting her effortlessly onto the polished surface, his mouth never leaving hers. The kiss deepened, turning from anger to something raw and unfiltered. Emma's hands roamed over his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat under her fingertips. Their breaths mingled, heavy and ragged, the room filled with the sounds of urgency and need. But then she pulled back, her chest heaving. This isn't just about Nathan, she whispered, her forehead resting against his. Liam's hand cupped, her cheek gently, his thumb tracing her jawline. I know, and he did. This wasn't just about jealousy or defiance. It was about them, about the storm they'd been dancing around since the moment they met. Later that night, after the heat had cooled, Emma sat beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. I'm not running from my past anymore, she said, softly. Liam kissed the top of her head, his arm tightening around her. Good, because I'm not going anywhere. For the first time she believed it, not because he said it, but because she finally felt strong enough to stand on her own, with or without him. The next morning dawned with a clarity Emma hadn't felt in years. The fear that Nathan had woven into the fabric of her life was still there, but it was frayed now, threadbare against the strength she'd found within herself. She didn't tell Liam where she was going. This was her battle to fight. She met Nathan in a sleek downtown cafe, its glass walls reflecting the sharp lines of the Austin skyline. The place was cold and clinical, much like the man sitting across from her. He wore a tailored suit, perfectly pressed, his expression smug as if he'd already won. Emma, he greeted, his tone dripping with condescension. Didn't expect. You'd have the nerve to face me alone. She didn't flinch. She was done shrinking under his gaze. I'm not here to play your games, she said, her voice steady. Whatever power you think you have over me, it's gone. Nathan leaned, back in his chair, a smug grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Is that what you think? You've always needed someone to keep you grounded, first me, now him." He nodded, clearly referring to Liam. Emma felt a flicker of rage, but she didn't let it control her. Instead, she leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his with the same intensity Liam had shown when he'd confronted Nathan outside the office. "You don't get to define me anymore," she said quietly, her words sharp as glass. "Not as your ex-wife, not as anyone's shadow. I was never weak, I just believed the lies you told me." Nathan's smile faltered, just a flicker, but enough to tell her she'd hit the mark. "I know who I am now," she continued, her voice rising with conviction. "I don't need your approval. I don't need your validation, and I sure as hell don't need your threats." Nathan's mask slipped for a brief second, his smugness replaced by something uglier. Fear. She stood, up, towering over him for the first time. "This is the last time we'll ever speak." As she walked away, she felt lighter, as if every step peeled away the layers of doubt he'd wrapped around her over the years. Outside, the Texas sun was warm against her skin. She inhaled deeply, feeling the weight lift completely. Liam was waiting for her at her apartment when she returned. He didn't ask where she'd been. He could see it in her eyes. "It's over," she said simply. He pulled her into his arms, not because she needed him to, but because she wanted him to, and that made all the difference. That night, they lay, together in silence, not as broken people trying to fill the cracks, but as two whole individuals choosing to be with each other, not out of fear, but out of love. The days after Emma's confrontation with Nathan felt like breathing fresh air after years spent underwater. The heaviness was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady pulse of freedom. But with that freedom came clarity, and clarity often led to difficult choices. She sat on the small balcony of her apartment, watching the city glow under the soft pink hue of dusk. Liam was inside, working on project drafts, his presence a constant comfort. Yet, as much as she cared for him, Emma realized something unsettling. She'd spent her entire life defining herself through someone else, first Nathan, then Liam. And while Liam was nothing like Nathan, she knew she couldn't fall into that same pattern again. She needed to choose herself. Later that evening, she found Liam in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, a glass of whiskey in hand. His easy smile faded when he saw her expression. "Hey," he said softly, setting the glass down. "Everything okay?" Emma nodded, but her heart was racing. "I need to talk to you." Liam leaned against the counter, his gaze steady and patient, like he already knew what was coming. "I love being with you," she started, her voice firm but tinged with emotion. "But I need to know who I am without anyone else defining me. For so long, I let other people's expectations shape me, and I can't lose myself again, not even in something good." Liam was silent for a moment, processing her words. Then he stepped closer, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I never wanted to be your anchor," he murmured. "Just someone who stands beside you." Tears welled in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense of being truly seen. She reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. "I know, and that's why this is so hard." They spent the night not as lovers tangled in passion, but as two souls wrapped in quiet understanding. They held each other, whispered truths, and shared silent tears, not for what was ending, but for what had been beautiful. The next morning, Emma packed a small bag. She wasn't running away, she was stepping into the next chapter of her life, on her own terms. Liam walked her to the door, his fingers trailing down her arm one last time. "Go find out who you are," he whispered, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "And if you ever want to find me again, you know where I'll be." Emma smiled through her tears, nodded, and walked out the door. Not because she didn't love him, but because she finally loved herself enough to choose her own path. Months had passed since Emma walked away from everything she thought she needed to find herself. The decision hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. For the first time in her life, she wasn't living in someone else's shadow. She wasn't Emma, the ex-wife. She wasn't Emma, the woman in love with Liam Mason. She was just Emma. And that was enough. Her new studio in Austin was small but vibrant, filled with sketches, fabrics, and bursts of color. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, warming the worn wooden floors beneath her feet. The walls weren't adorned with expensive art, but with her own work, pieces she'd designed with intention and passion. Emma stood in front of her latest project, a large canvas filled with bold lines and textures, reflecting not just her growth as a designer, but as a woman who had reclaimed her identity. There was no longer an ache in her chest when she thought of Nathan, only indifference. And thoughts of Liam. They brought a bittersweet warmth, not regret. One morning, as she was sorting through design proposals, her phone buzzed. A message from an unfamiliar number lit up the screen. "Congrats on the feature in the design journal. You're exactly where you're meant to be. LM." Emma stared at the message, her heart skipping a beat. A soft smile curved her lips, not the kind that came with longing, but with gratitude. She didn't respond. Not because she didn't care, but because there was nothing left to say. Later that evening, Emma visited the small cafe where she'd first met Nathan for their final confrontation. But today, it wasn't filled with tension. It was just a cafe, nothing more. She sat with her sketchbook, sipping her coffee, the pages filled with fresh ideas, bold concepts, and dreams that were finally hers. As the sun dipped below the Austin skyline, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, Emma realized something profound. Life wasn't about finding the perfect ending. It was about embracing the journey, the messy, beautiful, heartbreaking, liberating journey. She closed her sketchbook, stood up, and walked out with her head held high. Not because she had it all figured out, but because she was finally free. A year later, the city of Austin pulsed with the same vibrant energy, but Emma had changed. She walked through the bustling streets, not as someone searching for herself, but as someone who had finally arrived. Her design studio, Clark Interiors, was thriving. Projects lined her calendar, and her work had been featured in architectural magazines she once only dreamed of reading. But success wasn't the measure of her growth. It was how she felt waking up every morning. No anxiety, no fear, just quiet. Confidence and purpose. One evening, as the golden hour painted the city in soft amber hues, Emma stood by her studio window, sipping a glass of wine. The familiar buzz of her phone pulled her from her thoughts. It was an event invitation. Stone plus Mason Design Comity, annual showcase. Her heart skipped a beat, not from nerves, but from a tender curiosity. Without overthinking, she decided to go. This event was elegant, filled with warm lighting, minimalist decor, and faces both familiar and new. Emma moved through the crowd gracefully, her presence understated yet magnetic. Then she saw him. Liam stood across the room, talking with colleagues, his laughter easy, his charm undiminished. He glanced up, and their eyes met across the crowded space. For a moment, the noise faded. No tension, no regrets. Just two people with a shared history and their own separate journeys. Liam made his way toward her, a gentle smile on his face. "Emma Clark," he greeted softly, his eyes shining, with something between pride and warmth. "Didn't expect to see you here." She smiled, her heart steady. "Didn't expect to come." They talked about work, life, dreams, no lingering what-ifs, just genuine conversation between two people who had once mattered deeply to each other and maybe still did in a different way. As the night ended, Liam touched her arm lightly, the way someone does when they're saying goodbye to a part of their life. "I'm glad you found yourself," he said quietly. Emma smiled, her heart full, not of longing, but of peace. "I didn't find myself," she replied softly. "I created her." She left the event with no backward glances, walking into the cool night air, feeling the breeze against her skin, a woman whole, not because of love lost or found, but because she had chosen herself. Emma's story isn't just about heartbreak or new beginnings. It's about the courage to choose yourself when the world expects you to be someone else. It's a reminder that we aren't defined by the people who hurt us or the relationships we've outgrown. True strength comes from within, in the quiet decisions we make to stand tall even when it's hard. Have you ever had to let go of something or someone to find yourself? What was the moment that changed everything for you? share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your story, and if Emma's journey resonated with you, don't miss the next romantic story waiting on your screen. It's filled with the kind of passion, growth, and unexpected twists that will keep your heart racing.